Hello, everybody. It's week 6 of Practicing Stoicism. This week we're looking at sections 25 to 28 in the handbook. And the first one is interesting. Section 25 is looking at how we respond when other people get things that we don't, right? And in some cases, those are going to be things perhaps that we want. So if they get them and we don't, we might be jealous or envious or angry. We might feel hurt. We might feel we've been overlooked. And what Epictetus suggests is you start by asking yourself, are the things that those other people have received good or not? And we know from a Stoic point of view that the answer is going to be no, right? If it involves something that's not up to us, it's going to be indifferent. We might have preferences, but it's not going to be something that's really good or really bad. But what's interesting about this passage is it also is something that's maybe open to a wider audience. You don't have to agree with the Stoics. There's a more sort of straightforward way in which you can just sort of ask yourself, hey, is it a good thing? And if you do think it's good, even among the externals, among the things that are not up to us, well, then you shouldn't feel bad that someone else has received a good thing. You should you should work at just sort of feeling happy for them, right? That they got something good. Um, Similarly, he says, if you conclude that it's a bad thing that they've gotten, then you shouldn't be upset that you didn't get it, right? So there's sort of at least those are the two initial kind of ways of reacting that he draws attention to. And what are the sort of things he's talking about? He talks about things like being invited to a party or to a dinner, right? Maybe where you're placed at a table. Are you given a sort of prominent place near the guest of honor? Maybe you don't get invited at all, or where if there's a line of people, where are you placed? So this is partly about social activities where people are included and excluded, right? And that's a natural part of human life. And Epictetus is sort of addressing how we respond to those things. Another example he gives is if somebody treats you as a consultant or an expert, somebody comes to you with their question or their problem. I mean, it might be something at your job, or it might be a friend is struggling, and instead of asking you for advice, they ask somebody else, and you feel let down or you feel overlooked, right? Something like that. Um, but the main thing, of course, he's pointing out is that when it comes to these sorts of things that are not up to us, of course, we know the Stoics are going to say, just, remember, they're neither good nor bad. But even if you're sort of still thinking about them as potentially good or bad, just in kind of maybe as part of your ordinary habits, things that if you become a more committed Stoic, you might end up changing. Even if you're continuing to do that, he says, the other thing to sort of remember is that typically for these kinds of things, there's a price to pay. And that if you continue to think something is good, if it's something that you want, then you should be willing to pay the price. Um, if you're not willing to pay the price, but you still want it, then he thinks you're just being unfair and greedy. You're sort of expecting something, but you're basically expecting to be treated differently. Like you want what other people are getting, but you're not willing to pay what they've paid in order to get those things, right? And he gives like a really simple analogy. Like suppose you go to the market, the Saturday market, and you want to buy some lettuce. Well, you have to pay some money to get that lettuce, right? And the person who does pay the money, they get the lettuce. So if you're sitting there looking at them and they have the lettuce and you don't, you haven't necessarily been harmed or anything. I mean, you still have some money. You haven't spent your money, they did, right? But if you sort of think to yourself, well, I should also get the lettuce, but I shouldn't have to spend the money, like that doesn't make sense to Epictetus things, right? That would be unfair. That would be greedy. Um, so what about the case where we're talking about, I don't know, a case where we're talking about, like, say, getting invited to someone's house for dinner, um, right? To do that, you have to maybe pay attention to this person. You have to flatter them. You have to sort of hang out at their house or sort of be willing to sort of do, you basically, Epictetus says you have to be willing to pay that price. If you're willing to do it, then do it, and then you'll get to go to the dinner. But if you're not willing to, but you still feel like you've been wronged by not being invited, he thinks that's just crazy, right? And similarly, you also shouldn't think that you've got nothing, right? If you're not invited, because you didn't have to flatter the person, or you didn't have to put up with the other people who are jostling, trying to get an invitation. Okay, so partly what this remark is about is just kind of reminding us about the nature of social events, and where sometimes people are included, sometimes they're excluded, where people are ranked, and he's just getting us to be clear that in some cases, in our considered judgments, we're not actually going to think that we've been harmed. And in other cases, if we continue to think, hey, this is something we want, then we got to be willing to pay whatever the price is. Okay. 26 is interesting, the next remark that we looked at, because he starts out by talking about what he calls nature's purpose, or we could also translate this as the will of nature. Right, and this is something that the Stoics definitely thought of the world as sort of being infused with intent, purpose. Sometimes they talk about the will of Zeus or the will of the gods, and there's the suggestion in this remark is that if you want to learn what that is, like if you want to sort of learn what the gods expect for how things are going to go, or what thing, what is it like, what is the way of the world, then he says what we need to do is, if we want to learn these things, is look at situations where we all agree about them, and kind of what we think the appropriate response is. So these are the kind of case where we think there's an obvious expected response to what happens, right? And he starts again with a kind of an everyday kind of case, right? He says, imagine that somebody's slave breaks their master's drinking cup, right? So they break their cup. It's a little bit like something we saw back in Remark 3, right? There he also talked about having a mug or a cup that or a pot or something that you liked, that when it, and there it was about just reminding yourself of the nature of the thing that you liked and cared for, was that it is breakable. Well, here the focus is on, well, what do we think is an appropriate response when something like that happens, right? Somebody drops their master's drinking cup and it breaks. The master is there and their friends are there, and the response is, hey, just an accident, or that's the sort of thing that happens. That's the agreed upon response that and what we're doing is we're just sort of registering that, hey, in the world we live in, sometimes things break, sometimes accidents occur, right? But what Epictetus wants us to learn from that, right, is that the way that we respond to others in that situation, that common agreed upon response, is also the way that we should respond to ourselves, right? He says, when your own cup gets broken, acknowledge that you should be just the way you were when that happened to the other person's cup. Okay, so you're the one now that's sort of in the hot seat. You're the one whose thing has broken. And just as you think there's a natural and appropriate way to respond to another person whose cup has been broken, he's saying you should respond in the same way towards yourself. Okay? And then he says, like, think of this as a kind of rule, right? So basically treat yourself the way that you treat others. And think of this as a rule that you could apply in more challenging situations, right? Like the case of when a person's spouse or child dies, right? So much higher stakes. In a case like that, he says a typical response will be something like, that's life. I mean, and that's not meant in a cold way. I mean, it can just be like, that's terrible, whatever. I mean, we're sorry that happened, but that's the way of the world, right? But he says what typically happens for a person when it happens to them, right, when it's sort of personal, is they don't say that. They don't respond that way to their own case. They treat themselves as an exception. They say, alas, or poor me. And what he says is we should remember, right, how we feel when we hear of this happening to others, right? So in a sense, like the point of this remark is to kind of get us to focus on, the need to treat ourselves appropriately, to treat ourselves the way we think it's appropriate to treat others, right? We think there's a right and decent way to respond to the hardships of others, and we should also remember that and treat ourselves in the same right and decent way, right? If we don't, there's a way in which you could sort of say we're not being socially appropriate towards ourselves. We're being antisocial. We're being unneighborly towards ourselves. Okay, so that's an interesting kind of case where what we have in common with others helps us to learn about the way of the world, maybe the will or purpose of nature, and we learn what's the appropriate response. And then we need to find a way of kind of making sure that we include ourselves among those who we treat appropriately. Okay, 27 is a very short one, maybe one of the shortest in the whole handbook. It's just one sentence, right? Short enough we can probably just read it. No target is set up simply to be missed. And in the same way, nothing that occurs in the world is bad in its own nature as such. I would say start by focusing on the second half. Nothing in the world is bad by nature. We know that's a Stoic view, right? Good and bad, good and evil are located in the person, in their choices that they make, right? So nothing out in the world is going to be good or bad, right? It's just going to be out there. It's going to be things happening. It's going to be indifferent, morally speaking, to you, except for how you respond, right? So there's an analogy here, though, right? Like there's this idea of a target. Like a target, he says, is never set up to be missed. Well, what does that mean? It means something like for something to really be a genuine target, it seems like it needs to at least be possible to hit the target, right? I mean, if it was an impossible target, it's something that you might frustrate people with. You might create the impression that there's a target that they might be able to hit with the appropriate skill and aim and all that. But if it's not possible to hit it, then the way I would put it is it's not really a target. So for something to be a target, it has to be at least possible for you to hit it, and of course possible for you to miss. Same thing for things in the world. If they were inherently bad, it would mean there wouldn't be it wouldn't be possible for you to engage with that thing without kind of ending up with a bad result. But if things out in the world are indifferent and they're sort of morally neutral, then you can think of them as a kind of occasion for you to either do the right thing or do the wrong thing, right? If you do the right thing, you're going to ethically hit the target. If you do the wrong thing, you're going to ethically miss the target. So like the target is going to be how you exercise your choices. And the way that the world is set up, as the Stoics conceive it, is it's constantly providing you with opportunities to make those choices. And it doesn't set things up so that you will always fail or that it's impossible, right, to hit the target, right? It's going to always be possible to hit the target if you do the right thing. Okay, the last remark is another quite interesting one and short. So short enough probably we could just read it. Number 28. He says, if someone in the street were entrusted with your body, you would be furious. Yet you entrust your mind to anyone around who happens to insult you and allow it to be troubled and confused. Aren't you ashamed of it? Now, the first thing I would say is you have to kind of tease this apart, right? In that first sentence, if someone in the street were entrusted with your body, you would be furious. I think we have to kind of include the thought by someone else. So basically, if the authority that you currently have of your body were taken by someone and given to somebody else, right? Like they allowed that person control of your body, you would be angry. And in particular, you would be angry at the person who took away that authority and gave it to someone else. They took it they sort of entrusted it in some other person, right? Similarly, you might say if you entrusted your body to someone else and then they hurt you, I mean, you'd be mad at them, but you also might be angry at yourself for having sort of done that, right? So there's this sort of idea initially that the body is something that you have some authority over, that you oversee, that you take care of, and if someone interferes with that, you understandably would not be happy that they did that, right? And if someone kind of is responsible for the person who hurts your body, then you're going to be angry at them. If you're responsible, I think you also might be angry at yourself, right? So then there's an analogy though with the mind. Like, what about the mind? Like, the mind doesn't seem to be something that people can normally, like others, you kind of have to work it out. Like, could others entrust your mind to someone? Maybe a case might be where how you are educated and brought up. Your parents, right, have some oversight of your mind when you're younger, at least. And if they entrust your mind to certain teachers, and then those teachers do a bad job, well, you could understand why you might be disappointed and angry with your parents, right? Here, though, the final thought is, well, what about the case where you entrust your mind to another person? Well, how do you do that? He said, and the example he gives is an insult, right? Someone insults you. They say something that they're trying to hurt you. They're trying to hurt your feelings, right? And remember, we know that for the Stoics, right, you start with that impression, but for it to actually succeed as an insult, you have to endorse it, right? So you are responsible. And basically what he's saying is, in those cases where you endorse the impression that you've been insulted, where you make it a live insult, you are thereby entrusting your mind to this person that's trying to hurt you, right? And so in a sense, you become responsible for, right, the one who, I mean, you're responsible for sort of ending up with a kind of troubled, confused mind, right? It's not, I mean, obviously the person who insulted you, who tried to get you troubled, they're also to blame, right? But you played your role, right? And so you might think similar, like just like in the other cases, if you have entrusted your mind to another, or you have entrusted your body to another, just like if someone else had entrusted your body or your mind to another, you would be furious, or even better yet, maybe you'd be ashamed, like because you're the one that did it. So maybe instead of just being angry at yourself, you should feel shame, right? Why? Because you didn't have to do it, right? You had the ability to not entrust your mind to others, right? Like that's what we're shooting for. That's the goal. So it's an interesting kind of a case because where it seems really clear to us that we don't want other people doing things to our bodies, manipulating them, dragging them around, imprisoning them, right, enslaving them. It seems less clear, Epictetus thinks, in the case of the mind, like that we habitually do it. We let people get at and manipulate our minds in a way that we would never let them do with our bodies. Okay, that's it for this week. Hope you guys are doing well, and I will see you again next week.